Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Dr. Fergus Connolly. Fergus is the Performance Director for the University of Michigan Football. Prior to joining UM, Fergus spent 2 seasons with the San Francisco 49ers as Director of Elite Performance. Fergus has also worked as a performance consultant for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Cleveland Browns, New York Knicks, and multiple English Premier League, Australian rules, and professional rugby teams. He also served as sports science director with the Welsh Rugby Union and was strength and conditioning coach for the Bolton Wanderers football club. I recently completed Fergus's new book, Game Changer, and it's one of the most comprehensive resources I've come across that really encompasses all the relevant domains that comprise performance. It transcends sports performance, and I think this is a great resource for coaches, teachers, executives, even military commanders, pretty much anybody who's interested in getting an organization or a team or individual athletes to perform at a high level. Interestingly enough, Fergus has a master's in technology in advanced manufacturing technology, and also a PhD in computer integration-based optimization. So I guess computer science, essentially. And you think that those things have nothing to do with sports preparation, but I think his background as a generalist and sort of a connector of dots has helped Fergus see things through a very global lens, which is very important, obviously, when you're trying to optimize performance in an organization, but he also respects the details as well. So I think it's a great blend between, or this balance that we're always trying to figure out between being a generalist and a specialist. And people always say to be a good specialist, you have to be a generalist as well. And sometimes becoming a generalist can come at a cost as far as accumulating expertise in a particular field. But Fergus does a wonderful job of navigating that delicate balance. And I think his background in computer science and technology also makes him a great resource to opine on the topic of technology in sport, which is obviously a huge movement, big initiative now. And he speaks very intelligently about the limitations of technology and how to best use technology to measure the things that really matter. So really relevant issues all around, and I spoke to Fergus quite a bit offline, and I wish I'd recorded some of the things that we talked about, because even having read his book, which is close to 500 pages, our conversation just left me wanting so much more from him, and if we had the time, we'd probably still be talking, and we recorded about 8 hours ago at this point. So this podcast is by no means a substitute for the book. I would encourage all of you to read the book. We barely scratched the surface on some of the issues that Fergus goes into great depth to discuss, and he has so many more interesting projects in the works. So I look forward to hearing more from him, but in the meantime, enjoy our discussion. All right, Fergus, thank you so much for coming on. I know that you're in the middle of a busy season, so definitely appreciate your time. I want to get right into Game Changer, because there's so much there to talk about. And a big piece of Game Changer is your critique of sports science. So essentially you make the point that sports science has not delivered on its promises relative to some of the marketing claims. And you also make a great case that the sports science movement is sort of a microcosm for the overemphasis on physiological and physical ability in sport, and this false equivalence between science and technology. So we always, these products come out that are driven by commercial vendors, and they have a tech component. And so we've kind of associated technology with science, which I think can be problematic, and you go into that in the book. So basically you say that these physiological parameters are easy to measure, and because they're easy to measure, we ascribe a disproportionate amount of value to them, when you think we'd be better off or focusing or measuring the technical, tactical, and strategic things that have a much greater impact on winning and losing. And I kind of saw the same thing in the military, where it's very difficult to quantify strategic objectives. So we would focus on things like, body count, number of indirect fire attacks, IEDs, and you can paint a picture based on some of those more tactical metrics, but they don't always paint a strategic picture. So I guess what we're really trying to do in sport is figure out how do we objectively measure winning and losing. And that's a very difficult thing to do because it encompasses all these different objectives at various levels, whether it's strategic, tactical, technical, and even some of the physiological things that reflect what goes on in sport. So I guess my question is, how do we go about knowing what data to collect when we're just so oversaturated with information in sport now?
Well, that's a brilliant question, and I, the number of layers that you've gone through to present it, describe not just the complexity, but describe the pathway that we have to go through to identify the correct questions. So, you asked, you outlined the fact that, the question is really, how do we win or how do we lose? And there's even a question slightly above that in terms of, is winning and losing, I was asked this recently, is winning and losing the only thing? Is that the only thing that matters? And then the definition of a win. So if you're a young team starting out and you're a young coach, what's your definition of a winning season? Is it, how does that translate to progress? Is, if you're the Miami Dolphins and you're playing the Patriots, is the win coming within 2 points of them, or does it actually happen? You have to beat them on the scoreboard. And then even, as you described in conflict, is body count an example of or a definition of winning? Is the global objective of an invading force to defeat the opponent or to extricate itself from that situation safely? So the questions at a very high level are arguably more important than the detail, and that's a very good example of how we get distracted in sports science. We get caught up in which is the right GPS unit, the reliability, the variability of different units, when really on a higher level, on a bigger level, how do we get a win? What is our definition of a win? How do we define a win? And then what are the tools to measure that? And I think to sum it up in a very simple answer, to use two words, it's just we must have a quantitative and a qualitative assessment of a win or of a victory.
Yeah, and I love, because there's this debate going on when it comes to data and measuring things in sport, and it's do we measure a bunch of things not knowing what they're telling us and then try to figure out later on like where that data is going to lead us, or do we, and I think this is the case you make, look at the game and then work backwards from the game to determine what things we should measure? And it seems like in sport, a lot of what's going on now is this fishing expedition where we're just throwing a bunch of bait in the water and then we're trying to see what bites and then figure out how to ask the right questions. But I think so, if I'm mistaken, correct me, I think what you're saying is we need to ask the right questions first before we can start measuring things arbitrarily. Yes,
and we you also made an excellent point, which people miss, is that science and technology are not the same thing, and the assumption that just because we have technology now we've got a scientific program, and we have a plethora of wonderful technological gadgets that we can use to assess things, but many of the things that they measure do not correlate with or do not impact or do not give us useful information in terms of defining or helping understand a win. And the goal of technology and the goal of science is to allow the person, and this is still a people business, just like in the military, this is still a people business. We deal with people. We don't deal with machines. This is not manufacturing. And the goal of technology and science is to help measure, assess, but ultimately to provide an insight into what is happening on the field or with the athlete. It's not the goal is not to measure and provide a predictor. The goal is to provide an insight, a better understanding of what is happening, and then the interface is a human interface, a human to human interface, and that's what the goal is. And we sometimes have been distracted by this myth that we can measure, assess, come to a conclusion, impact without even perhaps in some cases even seeing the athlete, and that's not possible. That's and that perception has done a lot of damage, I believe, to our industry.
Yeah, and then can you talk a little bit about the distinction you make in the book between big data and agile data? I really love that distinction you made.
So the story of big data came, in this concept. Obviously, everybody or most people have seen the film Moneyball or read the book, and it's a wonderful Hollywood fairy tale. But the reality, at the is very different from what the movie portrayed as well. That's something that a lot of people aren't quite aware of. But this concept, of sabermetrics spawned an idea of big data that was happening at the same time with, for example, I think it was Woolworths or one of these huge stores in the States, where when it's a beautiful story. The company decided to look at all of the data across all of its stores and try and find something, because it happened it worked in Moneyball, so it must work in because we've so much data. So they started to look at all of their products, and they noticed that on a Thursday there was a spike in the sale of diapers, and they also noticed that there was a similar but not as big a spike in the sale of alcohol, beer, on a Thursday evening specifically. So when they started to analyze closer, they decided that these two trends were significant. So they said, okay, let's put diapers and beer together in the store and see what happens. And sales of both went through the roof. And the conclusion that they eventually came to, studying it sociologically, was that, or with a social influence, a social eye, were that when men were driving home on a Thursday evening with the paycheck, they would get a call from the wife to collect diapers on the way home, and they would invariably pick up beer. And this was the trend, and this was the idea of big data. The problem that people miss when it comes to sport is you don't have big data. At best, you have 100, 150 athletes. That's not big data. That's a small data set. You couldn't perform any pharma project, assessment, or trial with 150 people. You'd be laughed at. So this idea that you can take a team, can analyze data, and can find predictors, it's laughable. But you see so many teams, you see it in soccer, you see it some in football, you see it, who promote this idea that they have an analytical approach to performance. No, it's not possible. And the other big issue that we have in sport, and those of us who work in sport, work in the real world, know this, and know this is true. The quality of data is very, very poor because of the nature of the athlete that we're dealing with, the variety, the change. No two practice sessions are the same. They're moved, different times are moved. So the variables just mean that it is impossible to come up with proper correlations that can provide a significant indicator when it comes to reducing injury or some of these other claims that are made. So in sport, in the real world, you don't have big data. But you have to use agile data. You have to draw on the variance, and you do have to look at the data. You have to look at the information you have. But the knowledge you derive is by adjusting to the information you have at that point in time. So the idea that you can analyze large pieces of data is a myth. But you can use short blocks of data and make sudden adjustments and work using the art and using the knowledge and using the experience of the practitioners, the experts that you have working with the athletes.
Yeah, and the analytics movement is not unique to sport. I mean, we're seeing it in so many different disciplines where they're all trying to answer the same questions. And you have a pretty funny quote in the book, and I hope that I'm not butchering it, where you quote somebody, a scholar, who says something like, big data is like teenage sex. Everyone's trying to do it, but nobody knows what they're doing, or something along those lines, which I thought was perfectly nailed it. And so,
or everybody has said they've done it. You know what I mean? And
right.
Nobody quite has. And that's one of the biggest problems with our industry, is that there has been to date with some well-known people a lack of honesty. Be honest about what you've done and what you haven't done, and the idea that you've been able to analyze large swathes of data is just nonsense. We don't have it in sport. In soccer, you've got very small groups. Sure, you might have 2 or 3 years worth of data and you might come up with some correlation, but trust me, whatever result or conclusion you came to over those 2 or 3 years of data with all these different variables that have been all over, trust me, if you couldn't have seen that trend without analyzing the data, then you're not particularly good at your job. So this is the myth that is that has existed, and it's important for the young generation coming through to understand the truth about performance and improving performance.
Yeah, and then when it comes to any endeavor, people always sort of praise innovation and being on the cutting edge of things. And I thought your take on innovation as it relates to sports science was brilliant in the book. You basically say that with regard to analytics and other trendy phenomena, it's better to be a settler than a pioneer. I think those are the words you use. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we always want to be, and I've always had a philosophy of being the first to understand and develop different technologies, but primarily the first to apply them successfully. And there's a difference between being a pioneer and a settler. A pioneer was the first person out there, looking for gold, trying to find gold. But ultimately, it was the settler who came along afterwards, who settled and who mined and worked hard on the land or and mined, and found gold and got the gold. It's never the pioneer. It's never the first person, because it's so costly to, for example, be the very first person with GPS or be the very first person with heart rate variability, because the amount of learning capital, the amount of energy that has to go into that is incredibly difficult. And it's very, very difficult to do all of the research, to do all of the study, but ultimately then to get to, and it's essentially it's an omega phenomenon, whereby if you know the omega symbol, you have to go around in this long circle to eventually come back to where you were, but with that knowledge. So that's incredibly costly. But it's better to be the second person coming along to be able to exploit that knowledge and to apply it. The key is the application of your knowledge, the application of the technology. In other words, what are you going to do with the data now? How are you going to apply it? What is your protocol? What's the application of this learning? And that's the critical point. So, I've worked with a number of teams. I've audited teams, and it's sad in some cases where you present to the staff, but it's blunt and it's enlightening when you say to them, look, you have an excellent box ticking exercise. In other words, yes, you have GPS, that box is ticked. You have recovery, yes, that box is ticked. You have all of these boxes that are ticked, but you're not applying them. The application of these technologies is non-existent. So just having them doesn't mean that you're using them and using them properly. So don't be a pioneer. Don't be in a rush. Be the best settler. Be the best user, the best applier of the technology. And don't be afraid to get rid of it if it doesn't work.
Yeah, I thought that perspective was so insightful. And just to be clear, Game Changer, I don't think is a book for performance professionals or medical professionals. It's really for anybody who needs to or is trying to achieve optimal outcomes. So I think it's just as pertinent to coaches as it is to strength and conditioning coaches and to sports scientists. And you really go deep into tactics in the book, which I think is important, because ultimately, even if you're a performance professional or a medical or strength and conditioning professional, what you're trying to transfer is the key thing. And nobody really understands transfer, but whatever you're doing in this sort of detached environment, you want to carry over into the game. And you talk a lot about the concepts of manipulating space and maneuver and ball movement in the book. And you make the point that sometimes when it comes to evaluating performance, we might dismiss something in a player as a physical limitation, when in reality, what might manifest itself in a physical way is actually more of a tactical or a strategic issue. So can you give an example of when we might be sort of tricked into thinking that something is a physical issue when it might actually be an issue more related to tactics or strategy?
Well, these are things that I've known for almost 10 years, because over measuring and analyzing different sports. So each time I would move from team to team, I very rarely wanted to do the same thing again, because I wanted to look at something new. So I had the advantage of, when working in rugby, looking at movement and seeing the same phenomenon in sport, in football or in soccer, and the same here in the US. But so these are things that I have known. For example, that the player who moves the most may not necessarily be the best player. The player who moves most efficiently is because they see the game, they see space, and their tactical awareness is better, so they are more efficient in terms of their movement. Whereas very often the younger player who moves more is compensating for a lack of tactical experience by rushing into space, rushing out of space. So, and I've seen that with real data, with international rugby teams, with professional soccer teams, and it's only when you start to see it 2 or 3 times that you realize the why. And sometimes you ignore it. Sometimes you don't. It doesn't make sense to you until you see it 2 or 3 times. So the importance of a tactical understanding is not. It's not important to strength and conditioning. It's fundamental to strength and conditioning coaches. It's a fundamental foundational point that you are developing, or perhaps overdeveloping, a quality that this athlete may or may not need. It's not always the case that the best player is the best athlete. In many cases, it's the inverse. So the ability to profile the player and to understand tactics should be a fundamental step for any strength and conditioning coach, for any coach, because what ends up happening is that if you're a basketball coach, you're just a strength coach without a clear understanding of what the tactical or technical limitations are of that athlete. So you will find that on an off day, for example, with a football team, even the NFL, you're the guys who are the strongest and who like lifting weights are the guys who are going to come in and lift weights if they have a day off or if they're given the option. They're not going to work on their weakness, the thing that they don't like, when that is the one thing that possibly would help them improve the most, or they won't improve their handling, or they won't improve some psychological component. So it's very important to always look at the athlete as a whole. Otherwise, you're only improving one aspect that, very often in strength and conditioning, it's the aspect that the guy probably likes, which is, lifting weights or running or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and you touched on recovery a little bit earlier, so I want to go into more depth about that topic. There's this huge emphasis now on recovery strategies in sport, and the implication is that athletes at all times are always walking this microscopic line between readiness and recovery. And I want to be fair, not all sports are equally taxing, but it seems like we have this idea that these athletes are just so fragile and need to be implementing all these different recovery modalities every day throughout the season. And I love, you really go into great depth about these topics you call functional reserve and facilitation of function. So how can those concepts influence or change the way we look at recovery? Because it would seem that if you're committed to these concepts of functional reserve and facilitation of function, you make the athlete so adaptable that the stress of the game is not sufficiently destructive that you need to be neurotic about recovery all the time. So can you elaborate a little bit more on those concepts?
Yeah, so there are a number of different concepts that have formed my view of recovery and my view of stress on the athlete. So take, for example, a pianist who plays a tune on the piano at an incredibly precise and wonderful level. The nervous system fatigue on that pianist will drain him completely. A sprinter who runs a 100-meter sprint, one effort after the warm-up in an Olympic final will be drained so completely. His nervous system will be so exhausted. And why is that? And then why is it that some guys will play a football game here at the University of Michigan or at the Niners or wherever, and would be so exhausted? But they're completely different things, but they manage to draw on their reserves so completely. And this is what elite athletes can do. They can draw on, they can call on all of their central nervous function to be able to execute one single effort that they have practiced for so long. But the concept of recovery is, again, people focus too much on the detail rather than looking at the overall picture. And when you look at the concept of a morphocycle, taking the weekly cycle, we need to allow the athlete to adapt to a stress and not simply attempt to speed it up or blunt it. And very often, take, for example, cryotherapy, what we're doing in that instance with cryotherapy is we are exposing an athlete who is in a fatigue state to an even greater stress that forces the athlete into a fight or flight situation, even greater, and it actually delays recovery in most cases. So a recovery modality such as cold water, if you throw somebody into cold water, the two key questions are, where is the athlete at that point in time, and how much of a dose are you going to give them? That determines the outcome. So cold water can be pre-game, could be a stimulant for some people. Pre-game, it actually could relax some people. Post-game, it could delay recovery. In most cases, that's what it's going to do. It's going to delay recovery for 2 or 3 days. So there's an impression that just cold water immersion or cryotherapy has sped up recovery, when in fact what it has done has delayed recovery. So the concept, your understanding of recovery has to be crystal clear before you start to apply these things. But the most important point is that at a cellular level, the athlete only understands stress, and it only understands different types of stress. And we need to facilitate the body's own ability to recovery. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to facilitate a stimulus, because the cell doesn't know whether it's recovery or whether it's, the muscle doesn't know the difference between 7 reps and 6 reps, really. It just knows that it's lifted within a range. So it's a stress that's been applied to the tissue. Now, how do we facilitate that recovery? And that's the way that we need to look at this, look at the athlete, so that we can apply stimuli at the appropriate times and in the appropriate doses.
Yeah, I think that explanation segues nicely into the concept or the paradox of injury prevention. And in Game Changer, you suggest that there's really no way to operationally define injury prevention, and that the construct lacks practical application. So can you go into more detail about the injury prevention paradox?
So first of all, it has been suggested that if you, in a team context, that the team that has the fewest injuries wins the most games. It's like the sports science myth. It doesn't exist. There is no proof. If you look at records, it's very easy to see that certain teams that have won most trophies, and even in the NFL Super Bowl in recent years, have had more injuries recorded than other teams. So there is no direct correlation. Now, there is a correlation between injury to key decision makers and key players on teams, but not to groups as a whole. So in other words, you must perform at a very, very high level repeatedly to ingrain the tactical things that we spoke about, the tactical learning, tactical understanding, the decision making, the application of all of these things together. You must perform at that high level to ingrain these habits and instincts, which is what we're talking about. And when you do that, you run the risk of injury. It's an unfortunate consequence. You run the risk of injury. So you can't prevent injury and train at a very, very high level. Now, there is a movement, to attempt to try and do this with virtual reality and various other technologies, and you see it in universities where, there's an attempt to create sports science type of research projects. But the reality is that many of the academics are absolutely clueless in terms of understanding the direct application in terms of how do you win games and how do you prepare the athlete to win a game. You can do something in a lab, you can do research, you can do all of these things in isolation, but the application to the real world is the only place that's going to make a difference. So you need to prepare the athlete in that environment at a very high level, and you will run the risk of injury. Now, you can mitigate against it, and you can adapt the exercises so that you reduce the risk somewhat, but you can't nullify, or you can't reduce the richness of the experience of the athlete, or they're not going to develop the instinct, the habit in the way that you want them to develop it. And that's where the risk is. And that's where the great teams are very, very good at doing it. And this is where you train at an incredibly high intensity, but for short periods. So the volume is the one that you can reduce the risk in. The volume is where the greatest risk occurs, just as in terms of the quality of the exposure to the elite athlete.
Yeah, so it's kind of like you're differentiating between risk mitigation and making this very definitive statement. And you talk throughout the book about the importance of humility And I think humility is really the foundation of complexity theory. And I see Game Changer as really a book that just uses sport as a proxy for complexity. So in sport, you make the point that the different disciplines that involve more variables, like team sports, are much less easily explained by reductionist models than, say, an individual sport. And then you go into how that should look at or shape the way that we look at periodization. So what are the limitations of traditional periodization and peaking models in team sports using this complexity umbrella?
Well, in the U.S. has had a wonderful history of Olympic athletes and track and field athletes in individual sports, and it has such a wealth of it's unmatched in terms of the wealth of just pure talent, athletic talent, and the Olympic sports and Olympic history has meant that there's been some wonderful stories written and relayed about the development of these athletes. And again, it's a simple story to tell when you talk about an Olympian. It's not easy by any means, but it is a simple story to tell when you talk about an Olympic sport, because there are fewer variables. But in team sports, and there are some in the Olympics, so I'm being very generous, but in team sports, in football, in basketball, in ice hockey, in soccer, these sports involve a lot more complexity because of the variables that move. And this is the reason why sabermetrics has failed completely in soccer. It's never been proven to be effective. Yes, there have been myths written, but it hasn't proven to be effective, and certainly not in the performance arena. So the complexity and the failure to understand and respect that complexity has just meant that so many, like I say, whether it's academic institutions or academic institutes or sports science institutes that attempt to just waltz through these things just completely blind to and without any humility and without understanding the complexity, means that they're doomed to failure. And the variables mean that it must be understood on a global level, and that's why the book is written around a model, concepts, and principles that allow us to understand this, because we're not at a stage yet to do anything more, I don't believe. And that's why, again, I wrote the book to explain that the reductionist idea that we do apply here in the West, this concept of, if somebody doesn't make it to the ball on time or fails to catch a ball, well, he's slow, let's take him out, let's just work on his speed. We saw him, he was slow. Or the team conceded scores in the last 5 minutes, they're not fit, let's do more fitness. That reductionist mentality is brilliant and perfect for the manufacturer of automobiles or the manufacturer of planes, but it does not work when it comes to humans, it does not work in team sports, and it does not work in the sporting environment. And that's where the greatest failure occurs, this reductionist approach to problem solving. And the traditional periodization approach is a reflection on that. Let's work on strength, let's work on speed, let's work on power, and let's put it all together at the end. Doesn't work. Not in team sports. And the real downside is, which is of huge concern for me, is the welfare, particularly of student athletes, whereby that traditional periodized approach of strength, power, speed means that there's an incredible emphasis put on, an incredible stress put on the athlete in one isolated area for a large period of time, and the holistic athlete is ignored. So the traditional periodized approach puts incredible stress on student athletes for short periods of time, and pushes many of them to places that they don't need to go psychologically, and causes an incredible amount of stress. Whereas a more holistic morphocycle approach that looks at the whole athlete, that respects the societal rhythms, that respects the biological rhythms, and then fits the competition cycle on top of that, allows the better development of people. And this is, like I said, a people business. It's not, we're not just training athletes, we're training people for society.
Yeah, I think that's a good caution against trying to extrapolate data and information from one sport and arbitrarily applying it to another. I think in a sport like baseball, the whole is to a much greater extent the sum of the parts, compared to a sport like basketball, football, or soccer, where there's a lot more ball movement and there's more fluidity. So there's not as much summation between the individual efforts, and that reflects the bigger picture. I had Dr. Andy Morgan on here a couple weeks ago, and he's a psychology researcher, physician who's worked with some of the special operations units, and he's done a lot of research into what type of characteristics they're looking for psychologically during the selection courses. And he made the point, I respected him for it. He said, look, like, this is what we found in this particular environment, but a lot of even sports teams have tried to take his findings and apply them to American football or soccer or basketball. And he's like, look, like, this works for the military. I would implore you to do your own research and then try to figure out what characteristics are going to work for your environment, because context is everything when we're talking about these complex systems. And I think that also ties nicely into, you talk a lot about what good technical coaching should be, and I think your focus is more on the big picture, even though you appreciate the details. And you make the point that coaches shouldn't tell athletes how to complete a specific objective. They should really just give more guidance on what they're looking to achieve. So what should coaches emphasize, if not the minutia of how to complete a task?
Well, just on the point of the selection, that's an incredibly important point that people talk about. Yeah, I understand my sport's different, but this special operations unit have the best psychological seem to have the best psychological makeup. We need to get them. No, psychology, just like the physical performance, is specific to the task. In other words, you can have the world's, and I spent some time with John Kavanagh, Conor McGregor's coach, when I was back home last, and we spoke about, ironically, we're speaking about a female boxer who'd come to do some work in MMA, and who was just gassing out so quickly because she was so unused to it. But when he would do boxing with her, she could last forever. When both are described as or fitness is without question. But it's the same with psychological profile, the same with psychological stress. The psychological stress to execute a task that you are not familiar with will still cause fatigue, and will cause a huge amount of fatigue. And the profile that's needed is completely different. So, bringing in a special operator to talk about psychological mindset does not transfer. There is a specificity. It's not to say it's not of benefit, but the specificity is incredibly important. And when it comes to coaching and to the direction of coaches, again, it's important to outline, not to lose focus in terms of what the outcome is, but your instruction to the athlete has to be very, very carefully chosen, because we're really trying to develop intelligent players. And in Michigan here with Coach Harbaugh, we do that by obviously playing a lot of football, but the direction of coaching and the amount of verbal direct coaching or instruction is incredibly important. And there's been wonderful studies done with John Wooden, but what you're trying to do is you're trying to develop an intelligent player who can self-learn and even learn within the game. That's incredibly important. You want players to be able to adapt within the game, not adapt on a global scale, but learn subconsciously the minutiae of what's happening and be able to adjust. So when you give the player a principle, you give them some direction and you allow them to start to learn. And yes, you can give them some instruction if you think they're going too far, but you really want them to find the actual technique that is specific to them, because there is no perfect way to throw a ball. There is no perfect way for everybody to throw a ball. There's no perfect way for everybody to kick a ball. You want them to find the technique, the specific technique that suits them in that moment, in that context. And that's what you're trying to achieve. So that's incredibly important. A great example is Michael Johnson's running technique. Clyde Hart, if he, started to correct Michael Johnson's running technique, you would never have heard of him at all. So it's understanding that the athlete can be allowed to develop to reach a point and to reach a level, an elite level. And I think sometimes you see it in older coaches, because they have learned that very often athletes get there without a lot of direct coaching if they concentrate on providing the correct environment and experience for the athlete.
Yeah, I love that idea of just letting the environment dictate the adaptation. because human beings are great at adapting, and if you provide the right stress or stimulus, usually the adaptation kind of takes care of itself. I didn't plan on discussing this subject, but we were talking before we started recording, and obviously the kneeling during the national anthem, gestures that are taking place across the NFL are a pretty hot topic now, and as is often the case, we don't usually get all the pertinent information, and we rush to judgment about people, and a lot of times if we don't agree with a specific tactic or gesture, it's like an affront to our humanity, and I think that's one of the most divisive issues now is just the whole identity politics movement and people not actually listening, because as soon as they hear something they disagree with, they kind of victimize themselves, and then there's no platform for discussion after that. So you've actually worked with Colin Kaepernick, so I know that you have some unique insight. I wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, well, I think in that, just on Game Changer itself as an example, that, you know, and you said it, the book is so completely different, that it presents a so completely different idea that the people who will get the most from it are those who approach it with an open mind and who are open to hearing another side. So, you know, just like the issues that are facing the country at the minute when it comes to protesting about particular things, we have to look at these things and we have to accept them with an open mind and without a prejudice. And, you know, with the anthem protests, I think when people criticize what people do, that's fine. When they disagree with their politics, that's fine. But when it becomes personal about the person, I think that's can be disappointing. You know, I worked with Colin for almost a year and a half, and, you know, I can only speak to how he was to me and to anybody else I saw, and I honestly have never met anybody who was as polite a person one-on-one. Now, you can disagree with his politics, you can disagree with everything else, but when you see somebody of his ilk who treats the janitor, who treats the assistant to the assistant to the assistant coach in the same way, who stops, turns and looks at them in their eye and answers a question or speaks to them politely, you know, that's pretty impressive on a personal level. You can disagree with his politics or you can disagree with how he chooses to act, but as a person, on a personal level, you know, I couldn't speak highly enough about him. And again, everybody chooses to view, you know, the difference in how people choose to protest, and it's unfortunate that the country's facing this kind of thing, because I saw it, you know, I've seen it before at home in Ireland, where I grew up, where the issues sometimes get caught up in the emotion, and the actual issues themselves don't get debated for quite some time, and in the meantime there can be a lot of pain and anguish caused, you know, and you've served, so, you know, you have a different perspective on it also.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to this, and I actually want to devote a complete episode or two episodes to this topic. But I mean, again, I think you can disagree about tactics, but to just look at one isolated tactic that somebody uses to make a point and then judge that person's entire humanity, I think it comes down to what you emphasize in the book. It's really emotional control, and when things are emotionally taken out of context, it makes it much more difficult to listen and reason and sort of dissect the fundamental issues that are really at heart here. I think even, you know, except for the extremists, which is a very small segment of the population, I think most people, even the ones who are arguing about this, actually want the same thing, which is equality and justice. And, you know, people might disagree about how those things are best achieved, but everybody fundamentally wants the same thing. So I think this whole thing has really just been blown completely out of proportion, but that's kind of the where we are right now.
Well, I think the two other things are, I think that when you look at, you know, it's been said before that, and it's the same in sport, ironically, if you were to take all of the experts, you know, or so-called experts, or, you know, and original thinkers and put them in a room, they would probably agree on 99% of things. And it's the same with politics. For the most part, if you put them in a room, they'll agree with many things. It's their followers who you put them in another room and they'll end up fighting for days and days. So when you remove that like you said, that emotional thing, you can recognize that. And, being Irish and growing up in the 80s where there was plenty of trouble in Northern Ireland, you have to, at the end of the day, even being Irish, respect the British national anthem. You have to show some respect for other people. If you're going to make any progress, or if you're going to come to some agreement. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what the conflict is. Everybody ends up sitting down and talking about it. And the sooner you can get to that point, the sooner the conflict comes to some kind of an agreement. It doesn't mean that necessarily everybody's going to be happy, but the sooner that you transition through that, the quicker and the better it is for everybody. And unfortunately, the emotional the emotional paper that can be lit can detract from the argument, and that takes time. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you actually brought that up before the show, so we could talk about it and people could hear your perspective. All right, so I'm kind of curious, what's sort of next for you? I mean, you wrote this very thorough book that covers pretty much everything that's pertinent to performance. Where do you go from here? What are you interested in? What are your next projects that are intriguing you?
Well, I'm going to finish the year with Coach Harbaugh here at the Niners, or at the University of Michigan, just as I did at the Niners with him, and we'll see. I've got there's been a lot of interest in a second book that I've started, which is called Protocol, which is essentially I hate to use the word recipes, but essentially the answers to the questions. Okay, Fergus, we understand your principles now. How do I apply that tomorrow? Or what's the recovery protocol? Or what's the facilitation of recovery protocol? What's the training protocol to develop this, and this? How do I integrate both, nutrition, rehabilitation, and tactics together? What's the answer? What's the takeaway? So that's the next thing that I want to do. But on a philosophical level, on a higher level, I think there's a huge need to help establish a pathway for the holistic development of the student athlete. The welfare of the athlete that can play and make it to the next level with a resilient, holistically prepared model that can allow them achieve in sport and in life. And that's really my goal, is to help develop a model for that student athlete, because the US is unique, and those people who haven't traveled outside of the US won't appreciate that the idea of the student athlete with such pressures and everything is quite unique to the US. Most other countries don't have that kind of model. For example, if you're a very good soccer player in the UK, you might end up at an academy, soccer academy, but you don't end up in a university where you have, academic demands, you have sporting demands, and you may or may not make it to the next level professionally in terms of sport, but you may make it professionally in terms of a career. But we need to put a lot more emphasis into building good people who become good Michigan people. We need to put a better model in place to help develop good young student athletes who become good young Michigan student athletes in this instance, or wherever it might be, whether it's Penn State, whether it's Notre Dame, whether it's Oregon, wherever it is. And that's my goal, is to help establish that model, because if we can do that, then we see fewer of the issues that we see at the NFL or in the NBA, where players end up. And if you turn on ESPN, sadly, if you turn on ESPN and you watch, maybe 20-30% of the issues that are reported are to do with DUIs, unfortunate instances with domestic violence, or whatever it might be. So if we can address those challenges, and I touch on it in the book about the 5 challenges that we have to prevent and to develop good young people. If we can do that, then we develop good young people who can go out into the world and give a good example and be good role models for people going forward.
No, I love that, and I'm really interested to see how that turns out. So I'll be eagerly following that. And I also I think it's great that you have a second book in the works, because Game Changer is really theoretically very sound, and it doesn't tell you what to do. And I think when it comes to trying to evolve any profession, we need to have the theoretical blueprint, which is what Game Changer does. But I think case studies are really important, just having people share what they actually do. And I think that transparency provides a nice platform for discussion, because I don't think anybody in our field would read Game Changer and say, that doesn't make sense, but everyone's still doing different things. And not that we all have to do the same thing, and people don't need to necessarily, once you come out with your second book, follow your blueprint or Michigan's blueprint. But I think when we share what we do with one another, it helps us to kind of evolve and develop our own systems. So the theory only takes people so far, and you emphasize with the sports science movement that, we need to focus on the application. And so the fact that your second book is focused on the application, I think is great, because having the application alone without the theory to back it up can be problematic. So it's always, we love these either or discussions, but I think when it comes to complexity, we need to have the theoretical framework, but then also talk about, okay, what are the details and what are the boundaries that we're going to draw, because those boundaries can be kind of arbitrary and they're sort of social constructs, but we're human beings. We have no other way to do it, and we have to keep collaborating and having these conversations. And we talk about things like emotional control and listening and compassion and some of the things you're trying to instill in your student athletes. It makes the conversation much easier to have.
Well, that's why, the two points that you've outlined there. One is that I couldn't write the case study book. I couldn't give the examples without explaining, my methodology or my perspective on, on performance, on sports science, on coaching, because it wouldn't have any context for the protocols themselves. So it was important to establish that, and again, I don't particularly want everybody just to follow my book as a Bible. The goal is that, yes, I would love if you agree with it, but I'm more interested that it would make you think, that the reader will think and be challenged and develop their own philosophy, develop their own coaching, because ultimately that's what you will do. But feel it's to have the freedom to take it and to disagree with it, to challenge it and to challenge your way of thinking, and to come to your own conclusions. But the reason that I wrote the book was really to give, and particularly at the collegiate level, to give a holistic model for the development of the person, because, at various points in my career, whether it's been at rugby, at soccer, or at football, or at basketball, even the NBA, I've come across athletes who are fabulous athletes on the court, but have a slight imbalance perhaps in terms of their personal issues, so that the issues that you see that appear on the court or appear on the field are not football or basketball issues. They're personal issues, but they manifest on the court where the person comes under the greatest stress. In conflict, in the military, it's the same thing. The things that tend to affect the warfighter are a personal or social imbalance that, when the person is under most stress and conflict, that's when it manifests itself, and that's what we're trying to develop, and that's why it was important for me to write the book in the way that I did, to cover such a breadth. And that took a lot of work. It took a lot of convincing, that not just to write a strength training book, or not just because it's really 4 books that intertwine. And I could have written each one of them individually, or I could have just taken one, but it was important for me to write a book that addressed the holistic person who becomes the holistic athlete.
Yeah, I read Game Changer cover to cover, and I still got so much out of this conversation. So really appreciate your time, and I would implore anybody in our field, or even anybody who's just interested in maximizing performance outcomes, which I think is most fields, to give your book a look. It's just so thorough, and it really addresses all the factors that influence these types of outcomes. So thanks again so much for your time, especially in season. And I'm really looking forward to everything else that you have in the works. I mean, this is really exciting stuff.
Doug, thank you very much for the support. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.